Let me tell you a story. It's a story about the kind of quiet that lives out on the plains, the kind that's so big and so empty, it can swallow a scream before it even has a chance to echo. It's about a man named Charles, a simple rancher whose day was about to be split wide open, like a log hit by lightning. And it starts, as so many strange tales do, with a sound that didn't belong. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the baked dirt and the endless sea of yellow grass. Charles was riding the service track that ran alongside the railway, his mind on the price of feed and the coming winter. The world was asleep in the heat. Even the buzz of the flies seemed slow, lazy. Then he heard it, a scream, not an animal. It was human, thin and sharp, and it ripped through the heavy silence like a razor. His head snapped up, his eyes scanning the shimmering horizon. Nothing. Just the heat and the sky, and the two silver lines of the track stretching out to nowhere. He spurred his horse, the slow trot breaking into a canter. The sound had come from up ahead, somewhere along that lonely stretch of steel. Another scream came, weaker this time, choked off. It was a sound of pure terror, the kind that crawls right into your bones and stays there. He pushed the horse harder, leaning low over the saddle, the wind whipping at his face. He could feel a vibration now, a low hum coming up from the ground. Through the horse's hooves, a train was coming. The hum grew into a rumble, the rails beginning to sing their deadly song. And that's when he saw it, a shape, a flicker of movement by the tracks, maybe a mile ahead. At first he thought it was a discarded blanket, a trick of the heat. But as he got closer, the shape resolved itself, and the blood in his veins went cold. It was a woman. Her dress was torn, her hair a tangled mess plastered to her face with sweat and dirt. But that wasn't the worst of it, not even close. Her arms were stretched out wide, her wrists bound tight to one rail, her ankles were tied to the other. She was spread-eagled, a human sacrifice waiting for the metal god that was now thundering down the tracks. The train whistle shrieked, a sound that was no longer distant. It was here, it was now. And strapped to her chest, wrapped in a dirty piece of cloth, was a baby. Its tiny face was turned to the sky, oblivious. Charles didn't think. He just acted. He launched himself from the horse before it even stopped, his boots hitting the hard ground, his knife already in his hand. The ground was shaking now, the roar of the engine filling the world. The woman's eyes locked onto his. They were wild with fear, but there was something else in them too, a silent plea that wasn't for herself. Her gaze flicked down to the child on her chest. The rumble was a physical force pressing in on him, vibrating through his knees as he dropped beside her. He ignored her bindings for a second, slicing through the cloth holding the baby. He had to get the child clear. The knot was stubborn, greasy with grime. The train horn blasted again, a deafening, final warning. He sawed at the rope, the fibers finally giving way. He scooped the infant up, a bundle of warmth and terror, and for a split second, he didn't know what to do. He couldn't leave the woman. He couldn't save them both. The baby let out a tiny, mewling cry, a sound so fragile against the coming storm of steel and steam. He tucked the child under one arm like a sack of flour and turned back to the mother. The ropes on her wrist were thick, biting deep into her flesh. His knife sliced through the first one. The shadow of the engine was beginning to fall over them, a fast-moving darkness that was eating the sunlight. He moved to the second wrist, the rope parting with a final gritty tear. The train was a monster now, its iron face filling the horizon, the ground bucking beneath him. He scrambled to her ankles, his fingers fumbling with the knots. One gave way. He sawed frantically at the other. The roar was absolute, a physical wall of sound that drowned out his own ragged breaths. The last rope snapped. He grabbed the woman, hauling her up. Her legs gave way immediately, useless. There was no time. The engine was 20 yards away, 30 at most, a screaming avalanche of metal. He threw her over his shoulder, the baby pinned between their bodies, and he ran. He ran like he'd never run before, away from the tracks, his lungs on fire, his legs pumping against the shaking earth. The air ripped apart as the train screamed past, a hurricane of wind and heat and noise that almost knocked him off his feet. The ground shuddered violently as car after car thundered by. Each click-clack of the wheels, a beat of a heart that had almost stopped. They were maybe 30 paces away when the last car flew past, leaving behind a sudden ringing silence and the bitter smell of coal smoke. He stumbled to a stop, his chest heaving, and gently lowered the woman to the ground. He laid the baby back on her chest, its little face wrinkled and red from crying. The woman's eyes were closed, her skin a ghastly white under the dirt and sunburn. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She looked broken. He knelt beside her, his own heart still hammering against his ribs. He looked at the rope burns on her wrists and ankles, raw and bloody. Who would do this? What kind of monster leaves a woman and her child to be erased by a train? He gently brushed a strand of matted hair from her face. Her eyelids fluttered open. She looked at him, not with gratitude, but with a deep, haunting terror, as if she was seeing a ghost. Then her eyes flicked past him, toward the empty plains. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking for someone else. Her lips moved, forming a single soundless word. Run! Then, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, she went limp, her head lolling to the side as she slipped into unconsciousness. The baby started to whimper, a lonely sound in the vast, empty silence. Charles looked down at the woman, then back at the empty horizon. Run from what? The train was gone. The danger was over. But as he stood there, with the crying baby and the unconscious mother at his feet, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He had a terrible feeling that the train hadn't been the real threat. It was just the weapon. The monster was still out there, somewhere in the quiet, and it might be coming back. He carried them back to his horse, the woman a dead weight in his arms, the baby a warm, trembling bundle against his chest. Getting them both into the saddle was a clumsy, desperate struggle, but he managed it, settling the woman in front of him, her head resting against his shoulder. He turned the horse away from the rails, toward the low, weathered shape of his ranch house on the horizon. The sun was bleeding across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood. The silence had returned, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, watchful. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. He couldn't shake the woman's last, desperate warning. Run. As he rode, he glanced down at her wrist. The rope burn was angry and red, but underneath it, he saw something else. A mark. It was faint, partially obscured by the raw skin, but it was unmistakable. It looked like it had been burned into her flesh. A brand. It was a strange, intricate symbol, like a stylized letter A entwined with a serpent. It wasn't a cattle brand. It was something else entirely. Something personal. Something that marked her as belonging to someone. His gut twisted. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was calculated. This was a message. He looked out at the miles of empty land stretching before him, and for the first time in his life, his home didn't feel safe. It felt exposed. He was bringing something dangerous back with him, a piece of a puzzle he didn't understand. And he had no idea if closing his gate would be enough to keep the rest of that puzzle from following them home. The lights of the ranch were a welcome sight, a small yellow beacon in the growing dusk. As he rode into the yard, the door creaked open and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the lamplight. It was Mary, his sister. She stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her face etched with a familiar, no-nonsense severity. Mary wasn't a woman given to flights of fancy. She was as hard and practical as the land itself. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the scene at once. Charles, disheveled and grim-faced, and the unconscious, battered woman he held in his arms. She didn't ask what happened. She just came down the steps, her gaze fixed on the small bundle nestled between them. "Give me the child," she said, her voice low and steady. Charles passed the baby over, and Mary's rough, capable hands cradled the infant with a tenderness that always surprised him. She soothed the whimpering child with a soft shushing sound, her focus absolute. Charles dismounted, lifting the unconscious woman and carrying her inside. He laid her on the spare bed in the small guest room, the worn mattress sighing under the unexpected weight. In the dim light of the lamp, she looked even more fragile, the bruises on her face stark against her pale skin. Mary followed him in, the baby now quiet in her arms. She placed the infant in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from a wicker basket, then immediately set to work. She fetched a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, her movements efficient and sure. As she began to gently wash the grime from the woman's face, her brow furrowed. "Charles," she said, her voice tight, "come look at this." He stepped closer. Mary pointed to the woman's wrist where he had seen the brand. Now that the dirt was washed away, the mark was clearer. A perfect, cruel-looking A with a snake coiled around it. Mary's breath hitched. "I've seen this mark before," she whispered, and a flicker of something that looked like fear, a rare sight on his sister's face, passed through her eyes. Years ago, on a traveler who passed through. He was running, said the Abbott family had marked him for crossing them. The name hung in the air like poison. The Abbotts. They weren't just landowners. They were an empire. They owned the biggest cattle operation in 3 territories, held the deeds to the bank in the nearest town, and had the sheriff so deep in their pocket, he was practically a family pet. They were a law unto themselves, known for their ruthless ambition and the trail of broken men they'd left in their wake. "What in God's name has this girl gotten herself into with the Abbotts?" Mary murmured, more to herself than to him. Charles felt a cold dread seep deeper into his bones. He hadn't just saved a random stranger. He had pulled a piece of the Abbotts' property off their execution block. And the Abbotts did not take kindly to people interfering with their property. Mary continued her work, her movements now more tense. As she was cleaning the woman's neck, her fingers brushed against a thin chain tucked beneath the collar of her torn dress. Gently, she drew it out. Dangling from the end was a small silver locket. It was tarnished and dented, but it was still intact. Mary glanced at Charles, her eyes asking a silent question. He gave a slight nod. With a shared sense of trepidation, Mary carefully pried the locket open. They both leaned in, expecting to see the face of a husband, a lover, perhaps the father of the child. But that's not what they found. On one side, there was a faded, tiny portrait of a handsome young man with kind eyes, a man who was clearly not one of the hard-faced Abbotts Charles had seen in town. But it was the other side that made them both freeze. Tucked into the small frame, behind a thin piece of glass, wasn't a picture. It was a key, a very small, ornate, brass key, a key for a lockbox or a diary or something. Something important enough for this woman to keep hidden around her neck as she was being tied to a railroad track to die. The woman on the bed let out a soft moan, stirring from her deep unconsciousness. They both straightened up, Mary quickly tucking the locket back into the woman's dress. The mystery of their guest had just deepened tenfold. She was branded by the most dangerous family in the territory, and she was carrying a secret key. Charles looked from the sleeping woman to his sister's worried face, and he knew with absolute certainty that the trouble he'd feared was no longer on its way. It was already here, sleeping in his guest room. The woman whose name they learned was Anna woke in fits and starts through the night. Each time, her eyes would fly open in panic, her hands instinctively going to her chest, searching for the baby. Mary sat in a rocking chair in the corner, the infant Jane sleeping peacefully in her arms, and each time Anna woke, Mary would just murmur, "She's safe. You're both safe here," until the terror receded from Anna's eyes and she slipped back into an exhausted sleep. By morning, she was lucid, though weak. She sat propped against the pillows, cradling Jane, her gaze constantly drifting to the window, as if expecting to see a posse of riders cresting the hill. She spoke very little, answering Mary's gentle questions with single words, her voice a hoarse whisper. But Charles and Mary didn't press her. They knew that whatever story she had to tell, it would come on her own terms. The story, when it finally came, was a carefully edited version of the truth. She told them she had married a man from a wealthy family, a man she had loved. But his family, the Abbotts, had never approved. They were cruel, controlling people who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenient addition to their dynasty. When her husband died in a sudden hunting accident a few months ago, they had turned on her completely. They wanted her gone. They wanted to erase her and her child from their family's history. The railroad track, she explained, was their version of a clean slate. It was a horrifying story, and Charles felt a fresh wave of rage toward the faceless abbots. But even as she spoke, he sensed she was holding something back. She never mentioned the brand on her wrist, and she certainly didn't mention the locket. She was building a wall of partial truths, and he couldn't figure out why. What was she still so afraid of? A few days later, Charles had to ride into town for supplies. The small settlement was little more than a dusty street lined with a handful of buildings, all of them tacitly under the abbot's thumb. As Tom Weller, the storekeeper, was measuring out flour, he leaned over the counter. "Charles," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "be careful. 2 men were in here yesterday. Not locals, hard men. They were asking questions." Charles felt his stomach tighten. What kind of questions? Asking if anyone had seen a young woman, on her own, maybe with a baby. Said she was a relative of the Abbotts who'd run off after a mental breakdown. Said they were here to take her home, get her the help she needs. Tom wiped the counter with a rag, not meeting Charles's eye. "They were headed your way when they left. I figured you'd want to know." Charles paid for his supplies, his mind racing. So that was their story. The runaway, mentally unstable relative. It was a neat, clean lie that would ensure no one would help her. It also meant they knew she'd survived. They knew someone had cut her loose. And now, they were hunting her. He rode home with a new sense of urgency, his eyes scanning the landscape. The open plains, which had always felt like freedom, now felt like a trap. There was nowhere to hide. When he got back to the ranch, he saw Anna on the porch, rocking Jane in her arms. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a fragile thing that he was terrified would be shattered. He didn't tell her about the men right away. He waited until after supper, when the lamps were lit and the doors were bolted. He told her and Mary what Tom Weller had said, keeping his voice calm and steady. Anna's face went pale, her hands tightening around the sleeping baby, but she didn't cry. Her jaw set in a hard line, and a fire he hadn't seen before ignited in her eyes. "They will not take her," she said, her voice low and fierce. "They will not take my Jane." That night Charles didn't sleep. He sat on the porch in the dark, his rifle across his lap, watching the moonlit plains. The silence was absolute, but he knew it was a lie. They were out there. The hunters were closing in. He thought about the brand, the key, and the story that didn't quite add up. Anna wasn't just a victim running from a cruel family. She was protecting something, something more than just her child. The key around her neck wasn't just a memento, it was a weapon. And Charles was beginning to realize that the Abbotts weren't just trying to erase an embarrassment. They were trying to bury a secret that Anna was willing to die for. And now, whether he liked it or not, he was standing right in the middle of it. The quiet wait was the worst part. Every day the sun would rise and they would brace themselves for the sight of riders on the horizon. Every night they would listen for the sound of hoofbeats in the dark. A week passed in this state of suspended tension. Life on the ranch continued. Charles mended fences, Mary tended her garden, and Anna cared for Jane. An outsider might have seen a picture of simple domestic peace, but it was a fragile illusion, stretched thin over a deep well of fear. They were living on borrowed time, and they all knew it. The breaking point came on a moonless night. The wind was howling, a wild, mournful sound that rattled the windows and made the whole house groan. Charles was dozing in a chair by the hearth, his rifle leaning against the wall, when a sudden frantic barking from his dog, Buster, jolted him awake. He was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle. Mary appeared in the doorway of her room, a heavy cast-iron skillet in her hand. Anna was right behind her face a pale mask in the dim light, clutching Jane to her chest. Buster was going crazy at the front door, scratching and growling, his hair on end. "Get to the cellar," Charles said, his voice low and urgent. "Now!" Mary herded Anna toward the heavy trap door in the kitchen floor, without a word. Just as they disappeared below, a heavy thud slammed against the front door. Then another. They were trying to break it down. Charles moved to the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the curtains. He could see them now. 2 figures, silhouetted against the dark, their faces hidden by the brims of their hats. One was huge, broad-shouldered, wielding what looked like a heavy piece of timber as a battering ram. The other was wiry, moving like a cat, and he was holding a torch. The man with the torch grinned, a flash of white teeth in the darkness, and tossed it onto the dry thatch of the porch roof. The flames caught instantly, greedily, spreading with terrifying speed. The night exploded with light and the roar of the fire. Smoke began to pour into the house. They weren't just here to take Anna. They were here to burn them all to the ground, to wipe the entire ranch off the face of the earth, leaving nothing but ashes and unanswered questions. The front door splintered, then burst inward. The large man stormed in, a shotgun leveled, his eyes sweeping the room. "She's not here!" He bellowed over the roar of the fire. The second man slipped in behind him, a long knife gleaming in the firelight. "Check the other rooms! Burn it all!" Charles fired from the shadows. The blast from his rifle was deafening in the enclosed space. The big man grunted and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his shotgun clattering to the floor. The wiry man dove for cover, moving with unnatural speed. Smoke was filling the room, choking, blinding. The heat was becoming unbearable. Charles knew he couldn't stay there. He backed toward the kitchen, coughing, his eyes streaming. He had to get to Mary and Anna. He had to get them out. He heard a noise behind him and spun around just as the wiry man lunged out of the smoke, his knife slashing through the air. Charles parried with the rifle barrel, the clash of steel ringing out. They were locked in a desperate struggle, the man a whirlwind of flashing steel, his face contorted in a silent snarl. Charles was stronger, but the man was faster, his knife darting in, seeking any opening. The fire was roaring now, the ceiling timbers groaning. The whole house was turning into a death trap. Charles managed to shove the man back, creating a moment of space. He raised his rifle, but it was too late. The man was already gone, melting back into the swirling black smoke. Charles scrambled to the cellar door, throwing it open. "Out! Through the back!" he yelled down into the darkness. "The storm cellar exit!" He could hear coughing from below. Mary appeared first, her face black with soot, helping a terrified Anna, who was shielding Jane with her body. They clambered out and ran for the back door of the kitchen. Charles followed, turning to fire one last shot into the smoky chaos of the main room before slamming the door shut. They burst out into the yard. The whole front of the house was now an inferno, spitting sparks and flames into the night sky. But they weren't safe yet. The wiry man was circling around the side of the house, trying to cut them off from the barn. And the big man, wounded but not down, stumbled out the back door, raising a pistol. Time seemed to slow down. Charles saw the flash from the pistol's muzzle, saw Anna scream and stumble. He thought she was hit, but then he saw the figure that had appeared as if from nowhere. It was Mary. She had grabbed a heavy wood axe that was leaning against the house, and with a strength born of pure desperation, she had swung it like a pendulum. The wounded man hadn't seen her coming. The axe head caught him square in the chest with a sickening thud. He collapsed without a sound, but the wiry man was still coming. He was between them and the safety of the barn. Suddenly, a window on the second floor of the burning house shattered outward, and a figure landed on the porch roof below, rolled and dropped to the ground. It was the wiry man. He had jumped from the flames. He was burned, his clothes smoldering, but he was still on his feet, his knife still in his hand. He was cornered, a wounded animal, and he turned his hate-filled eyes on Anna. With a final, desperate scream of rage, he charged. But before he could take 2 steps, something whistled through the air. A rock, thrown with incredible force and accuracy, struck him in the side of the head. He staggered, dropping his knife, his eyes rolling back. He fell to the ground, unconscious. Charles looked toward the woodpile, where the rock had come from. A small figure was standing there, his chest heaving. It was Jed, their young ranch hand, who was supposed to be sleeping in the bunkhouse. He had seen the fire and come running. He had saved them. The 4 of them stood there in the flickering firelight, breathing heavily, surrounded by the ruins of their home. They had survived. They had won. But as Charles looked at the burning house, at the bodies in the yard, and at the terrified faces of his small, battered family, he knew this was only the beginning. The Abbotts had tried to silence them with fire and death. They had failed. But they would be back. And next time, They would not send just 2 men. They would send an army. Staying here was no longer an option. It was a death sentence. They took refuge in the barn, the smell of hay and animals a strange comfort against the acrid smoke that filled the air. Mary tended to everyone's minor cuts and burns with a grim efficiency, while Jed, still wide-eyed with shock, brought them water from the well. Anna sat on a pile of hay, rocking Jane, her body trembling uncontrollably. The fire had burned itself out by dawn, leaving behind a smoldering, skeletal ruin that had once been their home. They had lost everything, everything except their lives. "They won't stop," Anna whispered, her voice hollow. "As long as I'm alive, they will never stop hunting me." Charles knelt in front of her. "Then you have to tell us, Anna. Everything. The part of the story you left out. The brand, the locket, the key. We can't fight what we don't understand." Anna looked at Mary, then at Jed, and finally at Charles. The fire had burned away her last reservations. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the real story finally came pouring out. "My husband's name was not Abbott," she began, her voice gaining strength with every word. "It was Miller, William Miller. His family owned the valley to the east of here, the land the railroad now runs through. They were good people, fair people." She explained that the Abbotts had wanted that land for the railroad expansion. They made offers, then threats. The Millers refused to sell, so the Abbotts manufactured a border dispute, bribed a judge, and took the land through a corrupt legal battle, leaving the Millers with nothing. But William, her husband, had been clever. He was a clerk, and he had seen the Abbotts' corruption firsthand. He began secretly collecting evidence, copies of forged documents, letters detailing bribes, a ledger that chronicled every crime, every swindle, every life they had destroyed to build their empire. He had enough to ruin them, Anna said, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He was going to take it to the federal marshal, but they found out. His hunting accident was no accident. They murdered him in cold blood. The Abbotts then came for her, but they didn't just want to kill her. They wanted to humiliate her, to make an example of her. That's what the brand was for. They marked her like an animal, their property, a symbol of their absolute power. They took her, but not before she managed to hide the one thing that mattered, the key to the safe deposit box in the town of Redemption, where William had hidden the ledger. "The locket," Charles breathed, understanding flooding his mind. "The key is for the ledger." Anna nodded, tears finally streaming down her face. "It's all that's left of him. It's the only proof. The only way to get justice for what they did. That's why they want me dead. It's not about me. It's about what I know and what I carry." Suddenly, everything made sense. Her fear, her secrecy, the relentless, murderous pursuit. She wasn't just a widow. She was a witness. And Jane wasn't just her daughter. She was the last of the Miller line, the rightful heir to the land the Abbotts had stolen. This was never just a family feud. It was a war for land, for power, and for the truth. And Anna was carrying the one weapon that could win it. "Redemption is 100 miles from here," Mary said, her practical mind already working. "It's a long ride, and they'll be watching the roads." "They'll be watching for us," Charles corrected her. "They think you're a lone woman, helpless. They don't know you have allies." A plan began to form in his mind, audacious and desperate. "They burned our home to the ground. They tried to murder us in our beds. They think they've broken us. But they're wrong." He looked at the small group gathered in the barn. Mary, the tough-as-nails sister. Jed, the brave orphan boy. And Anna, the woman who had survived the unthinkable. They weren't an army, but they were a family, forged in fire and fear. "They started this," Charles said, his voice hard as iron. "But we are going to finish it. We're not going to run. We're going to ride. We're going to Redemption. We're going to get that ledger. And we are going to burn the Abbott empire to the ground." The decision was made. There was no turning back. They spent the day preparing, gathering what little they had salvaged. They had 3 good horses. Charles packed ammunition, dried rations, and a medical kit Mary put together. Anna, meanwhile, did something that surprised them all. She went to the bunkhouse and came back with a pair of Jed's old trousers and a shirt, which she changed into. Then she took Mary's sharpest shears and, with a grim look of determination, cut her long hair short, shearing it off until it was ragged and boyish. "They'll be looking for a woman with a baby," she said, her voice steady. "They won't be looking for two men, a boy and his sister." It was a clever disguise. With a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, she could easily pass for a young man from a distance. They decided to leave just after dusk, using the darkness to cover their escape. The plan was to avoid the main roads, cutting across the open country, using Charles's knowledge of the land to navigate. Their first stop had to be the town, the one Charles had visited just days ago. They needed more supplies, especially ammunition, and Charles wanted to talk to one person, Tom Weller, the storekeeper. He had warned Charles once. Maybe he could be trusted to help them again, to give them information about Abbott's movements. It was a risk, but one they had to take. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows from the burnt-out shell of the house, Charles took one last look around. This was his home, his legacy, and the Abbotts had turned it to ash. A cold, clean rage settled in his heart. This was no longer just about helping Anna. This was about retribution. They rode out as the first stars appeared, a small, desperate caravan moving through the vast, dark landscape. Jane was bundled securely in a sling on Anna's chest, sleeping soundly. They moved like ghosts, the horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth. The journey was tense, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible enemy. When they reached the outskirts of town, Charles dismounted. "I'll go in alone," he said. "The rest of you wait here in the cottonwoods by the creek. If I'm not back in an hour, ride. Ride hard and don't look back." Anna grabbed his arm. "Charles, no. It's too dangerous." "It's more dangerous if we don't know what we're riding into," he replied, his gaze firm. "I'll be careful." He slipped into the town under the cover of darkness, keeping to the alleys. The general store was dark, but a faint light flickered in the back room. Charles crept to the rear window and peered inside. Tom Weller was there, but he wasn't alone. Standing with him were two men, their faces hard and cruel in the lamplight. And sitting at the table, calmly sipping a glass of whiskey, was a man Charles recognized instantly from the wanted posters and the hushed, fearful whispers of the territory. It was Caleb Abbott himself, the patriarch, the monster at the heart of the empire. He was older than Charles expected, with silver hair and a finely tailored suit, but his eyes were like chips of ice, and as Charles watched, his blood ran cold. He saw Tom Weller gesturing at a map, pointing, his finger tracing a route across the open country, a route leading away from Charles's ranch. And then he saw Caleb Abbott slide a heavy bag of coins across the table. Tom Weller hadn't been warning him. He had been pumping him for information. He was an informant. He had sold them out. Charles backed away from the window, his heart pounding with a new, terrifying realization. The Abbotts didn't just have riders. They had eyes and ears everywhere. They hadn't just been hunting Anna. They had been playing with them, letting them think they had a chance, all while setting a trap. And he had just led his family straight toward the bait. He had to get back. He had to warn them. But as he turned to leave the alley, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. It was one of Abbott's men, the same huge man Charles had shot during the fire, his arm now in a sling, his face a mask of brutal fury. And in his good hand, he held a cocked pistol, aimed directly at Charles's heart. "Going somewhere, rancher?" the man growled. "The boss wants a word with you." The big man marched Charles back into the store's back room at gunpoint. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the smug scent of power. Caleb Abbott turned his cold eyes on Charles, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Charles," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "I've heard so much about you, the Good Samaritan, the brave hero. A pity your heroism was so misplaced." He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "You see, you've involved yourself in a private family matter. You've stolen my property." "She's not property," Charles spat, his hands clenched into fists. Abbott chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Everything in this territory is my property, in one way or another. including that little runaway and the brat she carries. I'm a man who likes to keep his accounts tidy. And you, sir, have created a mess." He leaned forward, his smile vanishing. "So, you're going to help me clean it up. You're going to tell me where she's going. And in return, I'll let your sister and that boy of yours live. A quick death for you, of course, for the trouble you've caused." Charles's mind was racing, desperately trying to find a way out. He was one man against three, and the entire town was in Abbott's pocket. He was trapped. But then he remembered who was waiting for him at the creek. He wasn't one man. He was one part of a family. He had to buy them time. "She's smart," Charles said, stalling. "She wouldn't have told me. She doesn't trust anyone." Abbott sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "A pity." He nodded to the big man. "Persuade him." The man grinned and backhanded Charles across the face, the force of the blow sending him staggering against the wall. His head exploded with pain. But as he looked up through the haze of pain, he saw something that made his heart leap. Through the back window, he saw a flicker of movement in the darkness outside, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. It was Mary. She had disobeyed him, and she wasn't alone. The big man raised his fist again, but before he could strike, the back door of the storeroom burst open. It wasn't Mary who came through. It was Jed, small and fast, a slingshot in his hand. He let fly a rock that caught the second gunman square in the temple. The man dropped like a stone. At the exact same moment, the window shattered inward. Mary swung through, a length of heavy chain in her hands. She had unhooked it from the town's well. She swung the chain in a vicious arc, catching the big man across his wounded shoulder. He howled in pain, his pistol flying from his grasp. Charles didn't hesitate. He launched himself at Caleb Abbott, tackling him and sending them both crashing over the table in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Abbott was surprisingly strong for his age, his fingers like claws as he gouged at Charles's eyes. Outside, Anna, disguised in her boy's clothes, was creating the perfect diversion. She had set a small fire in a hay wagon at the end of the street. People were shouting, doors were opening, the town's attention drawn away from the store. It was chaos. Beautiful, perfect chaos. Charles managed to land a solid punch on Abbott's jaw, dazing him. He scrambled for the fallen pistol, just as the big man, roaring with rage, recovered and charged at Mary. But Jed was there again. He had grabbed a heavy sack of flour and with all his might swung it into the back of the man's knees. The big man's legs buckled, and he went down hard. Mary didn't give him a chance to get up. She brought the chain down again and again. Charles scooped up the pistol and a box of cartridges from the table. "Go, now!" he yelled. They scrambled out the back door and melted into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of wreckage and confusion. They sprinted for the cottonwoods, their lungs burning. They could hear Abbott screaming in rage behind them. They found Anna waiting with the horses, her face pale but resolute. "Did you get it?" she asked Charles. "Ammunition," he said, holding up the box, "and a head start." They leaped into their saddles and rode, not away from town but parallel to it, using the commotion as cover. They had escaped the trap. They had struck a blow against the king himself. But it was a costly victory. Now Caleb Abbott wasn't just hunting a runaway. He was at war. His pride was wounded, his authority challenged. He would unleash everything he had. The full, brutal weight of his empire would now come crashing down on them. They were no longer just fugitives. They were rebels. And the road to redemption had just become 100 miles of pure, unforgiving hell. The flight from the town was a blur of adrenaline and fear. They rode hard through the night, pushing the horses, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Caleb Abbott's rage. Charles led them through treacherous, rocky canyons and across dry riverbeds, places where they were less likely to be seen, but where the going was slow and punishing. For 2 days they moved like phantoms, resting only when the horses were at their limit, eating cold rations in the saddle. The silence of the vast, empty landscape was a constant companion, but it was a menacing silence now, filled with the imagined sound of pursuit. On the 3rd day they spotted them. From a high ridge, Charles saw a dust cloud on the horizon behind them. It was a large group of riders, at least a dozen, moving fast. Abbott's posse. They're gaining on us, Mary said, her voice tight with exhaustion. The horses can't keep this pace forever. We don't have to outrun them forever, Charles said, his mind working furiously. We just have to outsmart them. He led them into a maze of badlands, a confusing network of steep-walled canyons and hoodoos that would slow down a large group and make tracking difficult. It was a gamble. The terrain was dangerous, and there was little water, but it was their only chance. For a day, they played a desperate game of cat and mouse, doubling back on their trail, using rock falls to cover their tracks, the posse always seemingly just one canyon behind. The strain was beginning to show. Jed was pale with exhaustion, Mary's face was a grim mask, and Anna was constantly checking on Jane, her fear for her child a palpable thing. It was during a brief rest in the shadow of a rock spire that Anna finally showed him. While Mary and Jed were watering the horses at a small, muddy seep, she pulled Charles aside. "There's more," she said, her voice low. She pulled the locket from her neck. She showed him how a tiny, almost invisible catch on the side allowed the back of it to pop open. It was a false back, and inside, folded into a minuscule square, was a piece of paper. It wasn't the ledger, it was a map. A hand-drawn map of the Miller property, the land the Abbotts had stolen. And on it, marked with a small X, was a location labeled the Sanctuary. "Sakinawu. William drew this for me, just before he died," Anna whispered. "He told me if anything ever happened to him, if I couldn't get to the ledger, I should go there. He said it was a place no one would ever find me, a place to hide." Charles studied the map. The sanctuary was located deep within the Badlands, not far from their current position. It was marked near a formation labeled the Three Sisters, a trio of distinctive rock pillars. "Why didn't you tell us about this before?" Charles asked, a hint of frustration in his voice. "Because going there felt like giving up," she said, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "It felt like letting them win. My goal was redemption, justice, not hiding." "Hiding and living to fight another day isn't giving up," Charles said gently. "It's surviving." A shout from Jed interrupted them. "Riders! They're coming up the canyon!" They were out of time. The posse had found them. They scrambled for the horses, but it was too late to run. The riders were closing in from the mouth of the narrow canyon, trapping them. There were at least 10 of them, led by the big wounded man from the fire, his face a thunder cloud of promised violence. "Nowhere left to run," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. They were cornered, trapped. But as Charles looked around in desperation, his eyes fell on the canyon wall beside them. It was steep, almost sheer, but it was crisscrossed with narrow ledges and handholds. And high above he could see them, 3 tall rock pillars standing against the blue sky. The Three Sisters. The sanctuary was close. "The map," Charles said urgently to Anna. "Where?" Anna pointed up, her finger trembling. "Up there, a cave hidden behind a rockfall." "We have to climb," Charles said. It was insane, a sheer cliff face with a baby, but it was their only chance. "Mary, Jed, you first! Go!" Mary didn't hesitate. She slung her rifle over her back and started up the rock face with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. Jed scrambled right after her. The riders below were dismounting, starting to fire, the bullets ricocheting off the rocks around them. "Your turn," Charles said to Anna. "Give me the baby." Anna looked at the terrifying climb, then at Jane, and her face was a mask of pure fear. But she nodded, her resolve hardening. She carefully transferred the sling with the sleeping baby to Charles. "Keep her safe," she whispered. "Always," he replied. Anna started to climb, her movements clumsy at first, then more confident as she found her rhythm. Charles went last, the baby secure against his chest, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He climbed with a desperate strength, his muscles screaming in protest, the weight of the child a precious, terrifying burden. Bullets whizzed past his head, chipping stone from the rock face. Below, the posse was trying to climb after them, but they were horsemen, not mountaineers, and their heavy boots slipped on the loose rock. He was almost to the ledge where Mary and the others were waiting when his foot slipped. For a sickening moment, he dangled by one hand, the full weight of his body and the child pulling him down. The baby, jostled by the movement, let out a cry. Below, the men whooped in triumph. "Got him now!" But then a hand grabbed his wrist. It was Mary, her face grim, her grip like iron. With her help, he found his footing again and scrambled the last few feet onto the ledge. They were safe for the moment. The ledge led to a narrow opening, almost completely hidden by a tumble of ancient rocks. The sanctuary. They slipped inside. It was a large dry cave, the air cool and still. It was a perfect fortress, accessible only by that one treacherous climb. They had made it. They were alive. But as they looked down from the mouth of the cave at the furious, impotent posse below, a new, cold reality set in. They were safe, but they were also trapped. They had no food, very little water, and a dozen angry men with rifles waiting for them at the bottom of a cliff. The sanctuary had saved their lives, but it might just become their tomb. For 3 days they were prisoners in the sky. The posse below settled in for a siege, confident that thirst and hunger would eventually do their work for them. The small amount of water they had was quickly dwindling, and the last of their dried beef was gone by the second day. The baby Jane began to fret, her cries weak and pitiful, a sound that tore at Anna's heart. Despair began to creep into the cool air of the cave. They had fought so hard only to be starved out like animals in a trap. On the third night, as a sliver of moon rose over the canyon, Charles was staring out at the campfires below when he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Anna. "William told me something else about this place," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "He said the old ones, the people who lived in these canyons long before us, they never built their homes without a back door." She led him to the rear of the cave. The rock wall looked solid, impenetrable. But Anna ran her hands over the surface, pressing, searching. "Here," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. Her fingers had found a slight depression, a crack that was almost invisible in the dim light. Together they pushed. At first nothing happened. But then, with a low grinding sound of rock on rock, a section of the wall began to move. It wasn't a door. It was a narrow, tight passage, just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. A gust of cool, damp air flowed out, carrying the scent of deep earth. It was an escape route. "We wait until the moon sets," Charles said, his voice filled with a renewed energy. "It's our only chance." The hours crawled by. Finally, the canyon was plunged into absolute darkness. One by one, they slipped into the tunnel. Charles went first, Mary second, then Jed. Anna, holding Jane tightly, went last. The passage was terrifyingly narrow, claustrophobic, and pitch black. They moved by touch, their hands scraping against the rough stone. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel began to slope upwards, and they could feel a faint breeze. They emerged gasping into the cool night air. They were on the other side of the mountain ridge, a full mile from the canyon where the posse was still camped, waiting for their surrender. They were free, but they were on foot, with no food, no water, and miles of hostile territory between them and redemption. Their horses were gone, likely taken by Abbott's men. They walked through the night, a desperate, silent march. Jane, thankfully, slept, exhausted from hunger. By dawn, they were on the verge of collapse. Jed stumbled, his face pale. Mary's stoicism was cracking, her steps unsteady. They found a small overhang to shelter from the rising sun, their situation bleaker than ever. I can't let my baby die out here," Anna sobbed, her composure finally breaking. Charles put a comforting arm around her. "We're not done yet," he said, though he had no idea what they could possibly do. And that's when they heard it. A sound carried on the morning breeze, the gentle, rhythmic clanging of a bell. It was coming from over the next rise. Hope, sharp and sudden, surged through him. He scrambled up the rocks to get a better view. And he saw it. It wasn't a town. It wasn't a ranch. It was a Spanish mission, its adobe walls glowing in the morning sun, a small cross atop its bell tower. It was an old, forgotten place, a relic from another time. But to them, it looked like heaven. With their last reserves of strength, they stumbled toward it. The heavy wooden gates were open. An old man, a priest with a kind, weathered face, met them in the courtyard. He took in their ragged appearance, their desperation, and his eyes filled with compassion. "Welcome, my children," he said, his voice gentle. You have found the mission of San Coronado. You are safe here. The priest, Father Michael, gave them water, then bread and cheese. It was the most delicious meal they had ever tasted. He showed them to clean, simple rooms where they could rest. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they could breathe. That evening, Charles told Father Michael their story. The priest listened patiently, his expression growing graver with each detail. When Charles was finished, the old man was silent for a long time. "The abbots," he said finally, his voice filled with a deep sadness, "their shadow falls over this whole land. They are a sickness, a poison in the soil." He looked at Charles, his eyes clear and firm. "You cannot fight them alone. You will need help, but God has brought you to my door, and I will not turn you away." The next day, Father Michael led Charles to a hidden cellar beneath the chapel. In it were not just wine and provisions, but a small arsenal of old, well-maintained rifles and boxes of ammunition. "This mission has a long history of defending the helpless," the priest said. "We were once a sanctuary for those fleeing corrupt governments. It seems those times have returned." He then introduced them to two men who worked at the mission. They were brothers, natives of the land, whose family had also been driven out by the abbots. Their names were Mateo and Thomas, and their eyes burned with a quiet, deep-seated hatred for the men who had stolen their heritage. They had allies. They had a fortress. And now, they had a new plan. Redemption was still the goal, but they wouldn't go as fugitives. They would go as an army. They would let the abbots come to them. Using one of the mission's horses, Mateo would ride to a nearby settlement, one not under Abbott's control, and send a telegram to the federal marshal telling him to meet them in Redemption in 1 week. Meanwhile, they would fortify the mission. They would turn the house of God into a stronghold, and they would make their stand. The final battle was coming, but this time it would be on their terms. The week at the mission was a strange calm before the inevitable storm. Under the guidance of Mateo and Thomas, they transformed the old adobe compound into a formidable defensive position. They barricaded windows, set up firing positions on the roof, and mapped out fields of fire. Jed, with his sharp eyes and slingshot, became their lookout, posted in the bell tower. Mary, practical as always, took charge of rationing their supplies and tending to their small arsenal. Anna, her strength and resolve returning with every passing day, cared for Jane and became the heart of their small resistance, her fierce determination inspiring them all. The peace was shattered on the morning of the 6th day. Jed's voice rang out from the bell tower, sharp and clear. "They're coming! A lot of them!" Charles scrambled to the roof. A massive cloud of dust was rising from the south. It was Caleb Abbott, and he had brought his entire private army. There were at least 30 riders, heavily armed, a moving cloud of dust and death. They surrounded the mission, their numbers overwhelming. Caleb Abbott himself rode forward, a white flag held aloft. He stopped just out of rifle range. "Charles!" he yelled, his voice carrying in the clear morning air. "You have defied me at every turn. You have cost me men and money. This ends now. Send out the woman and the child, and I will let the rest of you walk away." "You're a liar, Abbott!" Charles yelled back from the roof. "Your word is worth less than the dirt on my boots." Abbott's face contorted with rage. He dropped the white flag into the dust. "So be it. I will tear this place down brick by brick. I will salt the earth where it stood. No one defies me." He rode back to his men, and the attack began. The first wave came on horseback, charging the mission gates, firing their rifles wildly. But the mission's thick adobe walls held firm. From their positions on the roof and in the windows, Charles, Mary, Mateo, and Thomas returned fire, their shots measured and accurate. The charge broke, leaving several riderless horses and men bleeding in the dust. The abbots regrouped and began a more calculated siege, using the surrounding rocks and landscape for cover, pouring a steady stream of fire at the mission walls. The air filled with the crack of rifles and the whine of ricocheting bullets. The battle raged for hours. They were outnumbered, but they had cover, and they were fighting for their lives. Father Michael, refusing to take up a weapon, moved through the compound, bringing water, tending to the wounded. Mateo had taken a bullet to the arm and offering quiet prayers. Late in the afternoon, there was a lull in the fighting. Abbott's men were pulling back. "They're giving up?" Jed asked from the bell tower. No, Charles said, scanning the enemy lines. They're planning something else. He saw it then. A group of men were struggling with a heavy wagon, positioning it, aiming it toward the mission's main gate. It was packed with what looked like barrels of black powder. A bomb. They were going to blow the gate to Kingdom Come. Everyone, get back from the gate, Charles screamed. But they knew it wouldn't be enough. If that gate blew, Abbott's army would pour through, and they would be slaughtered. As the men with the wagon lit the fuse, a desperate, wild idea sparked in Anna's mind. She turned to Mary. "The lanterns," she said. "The ones in the chapel, filled with oil." They worked frantically, smashing the oil lanterns and soaking rags in the flammable liquid. Anna tied a rag to one of Jed's arrows. "Jed, can you hit that wagon?" she asked, her voice tight. The boy's face was pale, but he nodded, his jaw set. "I can try." He knocked the oil-soaked arrow, and Mary lit the tip. It burst into flame. Jed drew back the string, took a deep breath, and let it fly. The flaming arrow sailed through the air in a perfect, fiery arc. For a heart-stopping second, it looked like it would fall short, but it landed impossibly right in the back of the wagon, among the powder barrels. The explosion was immense, a blinding flash of light, followed by a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the mission. The wagon and the men around it simply ceased to exist. A wave of force and debris washed over the battlefield. The remaining Abbott men, stunned and terrified by the cataclysm, began to fall back in disarray. A cheer went up from the mission walls. They had done it. They had repelled the attack. But their victory was short-lived. Through the smoke and chaos, a lone figure was charging forward on horseback. It was Caleb Abbott. His army was broken, his plan was in ruins, and he had been driven mad by fury. He was riding straight for the now weakened gate, a pistol in each hand, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage. Charles raised his rifle, took aim. But before he could fire, another figure ran out into the courtyard, directly into Abbott's path. It was Anna. She was holding an old heavy Colt revolver, and she stood her ground, her feet planted, her eyes locked on the man who had destroyed her life. Abbott laughed, a crazed, high-pitched sound, and raised his pistol to fire. But Anna was faster. She fired once. The shot was true. Caleb Abbott was thrown from his saddle, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He hit the ground and did not move again. A stunned silence fell over the battlefield. The king was dead. His army, leaderless and broken, turned and fled, disappearing back into the dust from whence they came. It was over. They had won. Days later, the federal marshal arrived, summoned by Mateo's telegram. He found a battle-scarred mission, a group of exhausted but triumphant survivors, and a very dead Caleb Abbott. Anna gave him the key. Together they rode to redemption and opened the safe deposit box. The ledger was there. It was everything William had promised, a detailed account of 2 decades of Abbott's crimes. The Abbott empire, built on fear and blood, crumbled into dust. The land was returned to its rightful owners. Justice, slow and hard won, had finally come to the territory. In the months that followed, life began anew. Charles and Mary, with the help of their new friends, rebuilt their ranch, bigger and stronger than before. It became more than a home. It became a symbol of defiance, a sanctuary for others who had been broken by the old regime. One clear autumn day, with the cottonwoods turning gold along the creek, the traveling preacher came through. Under the shade of the big tree, Charles and Anna stood before him. They weren't the same 2 people who had met on that desperate day by the railroad tracks. They had been forged into something new by fire and trial. Their vows weren't just words of love. They were promises of partnership, of resilience, of a shared future built on the ashes of the past. They had faced down monsters and won. And as they stood together, with Jane laughing in Mary's arms and their small, unlikely family gathered around them, they knew they could face whatever came next as long as they faced it together. The quiet of the plains had returned, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with peace. Friends, what a journey that was. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you had to stand up against impossible odds for what you knew was right? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story of courage and justice resonated with you, do me a favor and hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the strange and the mysterious. And if you're ready for another story, one that will pull you in even deeper, click on that video you see on your screen now. The fire is lit, and I'll be waiting.